Hey guys, we're here for our second deck tech for post-cons of Tarkir Standard. We did the Rug Teamer Morph deck a little bit earlier, so check out that video, and now we're going to do an Azorius control deck video. So, start with the mana base for this deck, because it's got some stuff going on that's not just making mana. We've got a bunch of basic lands, which is standard in a 2-color deck, but we've also got 4 Radiant Fountains and 4 Tranquil Coves. So it's interesting that you have the option in this format in your 2-color decks to play a bunch of lands that gain life. So this deck is going to gain 6 to 8 life over the course of a game just by playing its land drops, which is very powerful against aggressive decks because that's basically the equivalent of getting 2 free cards on them just for doing what you want to be doing anyway as a control deck, which is just playing lands. So that helps to make up for what looks like a weakness of the deck, which is that it doesn't really have a lot of early plays that are removal. But you can afford to take that first 2 to 6 damage, because if you can prolong the game a couple more turns after that, you're just going to gain all that life back, and then you'll be starting as if you had an extra 5 life. So it's very strong against the aggressive decks. And the mana isn't really that bad against control decks either, so you're basically getting that life for free in the matchups where you need it, and then it just doesn't really have a drawback in the matchups where you don't need it. You've also got the standard 4 temples, just for a little bit of extra card filtering, dig to the stuff that you need. So then let's look at the deck. So first off, we've got some removal. We've got 4 Last Breath, 3 Banishing Light, 4 End Hostilities, and 2 Faded Retributions, and then we'll talk about these Quiet Contemplations a little bit more later. So Last Breath is your best option for 2 mana removal, which is important because you want to have an answer to Goblin Rabblemaster when you're on the draw. So Last Breath doesn't really do anything against control decks, and it's fairly weak against mid-range decks, but it's extremely powerful against the aggressive decks, so it's worth the slots for the 4 cards. Banishing Light, on the other hand, is not that great against the aggressive decks because it's a little bit expensive, but it's very strong against the mid-range and control decks because it answers Planeswalkers. The only thing that you can't really answer with your targeted removal is Stormbreath Dragon. So you need to make sure you have Wraths in your hand against the decks that are playing those, because you're going to just have to take a hit and then kill the thing with End Hostilities or Faded Retribution. So then we've got 6 sweepers. We've got 4 End Hostilities. So End Hostilities is basically Day of Judgment for 1 extra mana. But I have, in a couple of games, gotten the other text to be relevant. I've killed a Godsend, and I've killed a Boon Satyr, and then I've killed 2 Herald of Torment. So occasionally you do get that added effect that you're paying the 5th mana for. On balance, I would much rather have Day of Judgment, but End Hostilities does its job just fine. Because of all the life gain lands, you can afford to add 1 mana onto the cost of your sweeper, whereas if we were playing without the Radiant Fountains and Tranquil Coves, I think that 5 mana would just be too much. And then Faded Retribution is interesting for a couple reasons. First, it's an instant, so you can destroy creatures at the end of their turn or during the Declare Attacker step, and it also kills Planeswalkers. So this is actually a sweeper that you generally don't sideboard out against the control decks, because it's going to come down and kill their Elspeth and all the tokens that the Elspeth has made, or it'll kill their Sarkhan, or it'll kill their Ashiok and any creatures that the Ashiok has stolen. So then we've got 8 draw spells, we've got 4 divinations, and 4 treasure crews. This is just going to give you some raw card draw to just find anything you may be missing. You can run Dig Through Time instead of treasure crews if you have them. I'm trying them in the paper version, but they're still a little bit expensive online. This deck, as it sits right now, is actually very inexpensive. It's a good budget option. I believe it came in at around 30 tickets for the entire deck in the sideboard, which for a control deck is actually pretty impressive. And most of that cost was in the temples and the banishing lights. The rest of the deck is not very expensive at all, and even the temples are only like 4 or 5 tickets apiece. So then for finishers, we have 4 Prognostic Sphinx. Sphinx is a little bit slow, but it keeps digging you into counters and removal, so it's kind of hard to lose with this deck. when you have Prognostic Sphinx attacking repeatedly, and if you can keep it in play long enough, eventually the 3 points of damage will add up to 21 and your opponent will be dead to it. That doesn't generally happen very often because there's things like Stormbreath Dragon and Arbor Colossus that can just block the Sphinx and then force you to Wrath and you lose your Sphinx. But it gets a lot of damage in incidentally, so that when you play your actual finisher, which is the Stormtide Leviathan, it only takes 1 or 2 shots for them to be dead with that, so they don't have a lot of time to draw a removal spell, if they even have anything that can answer an 8/8. So Stormtide Leviathan is interesting. It's been printed a lot of times and never really done anything. Originally, I had the Pearl Lake Ancients in the main deck because I was worried about control decks, but there's not a lot of control decks online, and the ones that there are not running a lot of counter spells anyway. So Stormtide Leviathan is very strong against the green mid-range decks because it makes Arbor Colossus and Pelucranos and Courser of Krufix and Xenagos tokens just not able to attack at all, and it's also unblockable because it turns all lands into islands and has Island Walk. You do still have to worry about Hornet Queen because Hornet Queen is 6 power flying in the air. That can put a lot of pressure on your life because flyers can still attack. But Stormtide Leviathan is generally very strong. If you can get it down against the red deck, they need to have either a huge amount of burn, which if they do, they probably would have killed you with that burn anyway, or they're just dead because they don't have anything that can attack because all their goblins and warriors are just stuck on the ground waiting for the water to recede so they can attack, and it never happens because Stormtide Leviathan eats their controller. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about this playset of Quiet Contemplation. This is actually the card that makes the deck possible. You'll notice we're playing 4 Quiet Contemplation and only 3 Banishing Light, which may seem very weird because Banishing Light is a proven good card, but Quiet Contemplation is actually incredibly strong. Quiet Contemplation is the reason I'm running Fated Retribution instead of Perilous Vault, because being able to just keep your contemplations on the table is so incredibly strong that it's worth sacrificing the ability to hit opposing artifacts and enchantments with your expensive sweeper. If you have 2 Quiet Contemplations on the board, it's very unlikely your opponent will ever be able to beat you, because they'll play a 3rd creature and you'll Last Breath their smallest guy and tap down their 2 biggest guys, and then they won't be able to attack. You'll attack with your Sphinx. They'll play another guy or a Planeswalker, you dissolve it, tap both their guys again, or play a Banishing Light, hit a guy, tap down all their guys, or even just play another Quiet Contemplation and tap down both their guys. So you have the 8 draw spells that draw you into more spells and also trigger Quiet Contemplation themselves. So once you have a Quiet Contemplation in play, your opponent has to have a massive army to be able to get in for any damage at all. And meanwhile, you're playing Tranquil Coves and Radiant Fountains and just completely negating all the incidental damage that they've done over the course of the game up to there. So if you have a turn 3 Quiet Contemplation against a mid-range deck, they're in a lot of trouble. The aggro decks are a little bit better off because they have things like Rabblemaster that can flood the board with tokens, and you can only lock down the biggest guy and you still take 4 or 5 a turn, and you're forced to use End Hostilities. But the mid-range decks often have just 1 Pelucranos or 1 Stormbreath Dragon, and if you can keep that tapped down for a couple turns, they'll be forced to play more large threats, and then you can play your sleepers and catch their large threats, get 2 or 3 real creatures, and then a couple of incidental mana guys, and just get a huge amount of value out of your sleeper, because Quiet Contemplation just completely forces them to overextend if they want to have any shot of winning the game. Quiet Contemplation is, in my opinion, what really makes this deck possible in this format. Without the Quiet Contemplation, you could build a blue-white control deck, but it would struggle far too much with cheap, effective threats like Pelucranos or Mantis Rider. So let's look over at the sideboard here. No, let's not do that. Let's look over at the sideboard here. We've got 2 more Fated Retributions to bring in against the decks with Planeswalkers or the mid-range decks with lots of creatures. We've got Pearl Lake Ancients. Against the control decks that aren't really running a lot of creatures, it's better to take out the Leviathans and bring in the Ancients, because the Ancient has the ability to return land so it doesn't die to targeted removal or sleepers, whereas Stormtide against decks with no creatures is just a giant vanilla monster most of the time. We've got 3 Deicides. This will kill coursers, banishing lights, but it also is very good against gods. Obviously, that's what it was designed to beat. So if your opponent is playing something like Erebos that's giving you a little bit of trouble, you just bring in Deicide and exile all their copies of it, and you don't have to worry about it anymore. And a lot of decks just have a bunch of enchantments. There's also Constellation decks running around, which Deicide is obviously great against. We've got a playset of Nyx Fleece Rams. These come in against the aggressive decks, obviously. They're a little awkward because you have so many sweepers that eventually your Ram is going to go away. But it'll just gain you a bunch of life and block a bunch of damage in the meantime, and that's all you can really ask for 2 mana. This just shores up the lack of good 2 mana removal spells besides Last Breath against the aggro decks. Finally, we've got a playset of Negates. This is again for the control decks. Against the control decks, you're taking out things like Last Breath and End Hostilities. So you need to have something that you can bring in that still gives you that early interaction, but interacts with the cards that you actually care about from them, like Ashiok or Thoughtseize or Despise is not really that important, but it is annoying if it hits a Prognostic Sphinx. So you just want to have the Negate so you can deal with what they have going on. And then you don't have to worry about things so much. So you just have a bunch of draw spells and a bunch of counters and some uncounterable or hexproof threats. Finally, one thing I wanted to point out, the Pearl Lake Ancient is actually very good against the burn decks like Jeskai Tempo, because you can return 3 lands you control to your owner's hand, and when you're returning 2 Radiant Fountains and a Tranquil Cove, that just gains you 5 life over the next 3 turns. So you have a large creature that's big enough to beat down on them, but it's also gaining you life and dodging things like Chain to the Rocks. So if their deck has a lot of burn but not a lot of ground guys, or if only their ground guy is Goblin Rabblemaster, then you can bring Pearl Lake Ancient in instead of Stormtide and just use that ability to gain life. Turn the cost into another advantage. So that is the Azorius control deck that I've got put together for you guys. Thank you for watching. I'll have some games up later this week. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you enjoy the games later.